Good morning and welcome to the latest webinar in the Anaphylaxis Campaign series of educational webinars looking at various different aspects of living with allergy. This morning I'm joined by Moira Austin.
Good morning.
Moira is our Helpline and Information Manager, and together we're going to explore some of the issues that you might come across when starting school. So we're looking at specifically starting school for the first time and transitioning to secondary school, and some of the obstacles that you might encounter along the way. A couple of things just to note about the webinar. If during the course of the session you think of a question that you'd like us to answer, please feel free to type it into the box that you can see on your screen now. We won't be answering questions as we go along, but we will answer all questions afterwards. Please bear in mind that we do have a series of questions that people have sent in advance that we will answer throughout the broadcast. So bear with us because we may well answer your question. If you do have a question that you think may be a bit more specific or something you'd like to discuss with us, please feel free to call our helpline on 01252 542 029 and ask for Moira or Mandy. I'll repeat that telephone number at the end of the broadcast. So Moira, first of all, what we wanted to look at was some advice on parents whose children are due to start at reception. So there'll be a number of children with allergies who've started this September and those that are due to start next September. What advice can you give us to prepare in advance for this very important milestone in your child's life?
I think it's really important to make contact with the school in advance of your child starting, and the earlier the better, really. So go along and have a chat with the head teacher. Most schools nowadays already have pupils who have allergies in the school, so it's quite likely that the school will already have policies in place to deal with children with severe allergies. But obviously the school will need to know about the specific circumstances of your child's allergies, what they're allergic to. It's quite likely that they will have care plans, but of course it's important that your own child has their own personalised care plan that's been drawn up probably by your son or your daughter's treating allergy specialist. But it would be quite good also to have some sort of input from the school, maybe the school nurse, and obviously the parent.
And it's important to note that although the school will be very much involved in this, you as a parent should really make the first advance towards the school, shouldn't you? And check that your child's individual needs are being catered for.
Absolutely, yes. As I say, most children who have potentially severe allergies will be under an allergy specialist, and they will have had a care plan produced, and possibly that they'll have used it at the nursery. So go in and have a chat with the school. Let the school know what your child's allergies are. The Anaphylaxis Campaign has fact sheets on all the major allergens on its website. So you could go onto the website, print off the fact sheets that relate to your child's particular allergies, and show them to the school. Just ask which staff are trained up in how to administer adrenaline injectors. Make sure that your child's form teacher is trained up, and just ask what their protocol is. In an emergency, but also looking at things like lunchtime. What happens at lunchtime? Do the children all sit together? Are they in their classrooms? Do they go into the dining hall? So find out a little bit about what goes on in the school.
And also, the Anaphylaxis Campaign have just launched a new online training package, haven't we, for school staff as part of our Allergy Wise training. So as well as there being information for school nurses and healthcare professionals, we've just launched for school staff and teachers, haven't we?
You're absolutely right, Mandy, yes. We have 3 courses really that are probably relevant. There's a course for parents and carers, so hopefully the parents themselves will have done this course. We've had a course for school nurses that's been going for many years, and that enables school nurses to actually go into the schools and cascade that training down to staff in the schools. But the new course that we've just developed is actually for school staff, and that would be great if the child's form teacher and other staff members could do that.
That's a really good idea. So if you join as a member of the Anaphylaxis Campaign, you get free access to the Parent and Carers course, which you then can do as parents. But in addition, you could then give the link to the teacher to make sure the teacher was aware as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, and I think it's also important to note, isn't it, that once you know which school your child is going to, once they've been allocated a place, you can make contact very, very soon, can't you? Don't leave it until the last minute.
Yes, I think the sooner the better, just to make sure that everything's ready for your child starting. Yes, I mean, don't worry about leaving it until the week before they start.
No.
Go along as soon as you can, really.
Don't turn up on the first day with your EpiPens or your Jex or your Emerade in your hands. So I think that the information there is that it's an anxious time for you as parents, and it is something that you do need to plan for. But most schools now, as Moira said, are equipped to deal with this, and it's something that they're very open to hearing about. And Moira, tell me, is the same advice relevant when your child is moving up to secondary school? I would imagine there are some different issues, but it's still that planning in advance, isn't it?
It is that planning in advance, yes. Obviously, once a child goes up to secondary school, we would hope that they would start to be taking more responsibility for their allergies themselves. So by that sort of age, and possibly at the end of the junior school, they should be familiar with how to use their own injectors, although you wouldn't expect the child, him or herself, to manage a reaction, but at least they should know what to do. And you can get hold of trainer devices for all of the 3 injectors that are available. So get hold of a trainer injector, get your child to sort of practice how to use it. Also at secondary school, it's fairly normal, because the schools are very large and spread out. The common practice is quite often, if your child has two devices, 2 injectors, to carry one with them. So that will be with them at all times. And quite often the second injector will be stored somewhere, just as it would in the primary school, so in a staff room, maybe in the head teacher's room. So that's the backup. If the child were to have a reaction, then they would use the pen that they have.
Right.
If they can use it themselves, fine, but obviously the care plan should kick in if they were to have a reaction. Yeah. And appropriate staff would be called, and somebody would use the injector. Somebody would be sent to get the backup injector. But also, yes, I think it's great if perhaps the child's peers, their friends, know what to do. Again, not necessarily know how to use the injectors, but at least know what to do. Yeah. If the child has a reaction, so know who to call, know to sort of lay them down and make sure they don't move.
And just very basically to know that there is an allergy and the child is carrying a life-saving emergency device. That's a very important thing to note. Yep. And I know that some parents will save an out-of-date injector for the young person to use into an apple or an orange to feel the real force of an injector, because it feels very different, doesn't it, to the trainer pen?
It does, absolutely, yes. It's really important that the trainer pens are used on a very regular basis. But once the actual injectors have gone past their use-by date, it's really helpful to actually to practice into an orange or something, just to see exactly what it's like.
And make sure that the peer group know how to use it and when to use it, but also, as importantly, to know to get help if they're in any doubt whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, and of course, Mandy, we know that schools in England are now required to ensure that children and young people are not excluded because of their health conditions. Isn't that right?
Yes, it is. The Anaphylaxis Campaign were part of a coalition of charities who support people with health conditions, and we managed to get an amendment into the Children and Families Bill in 2014, which now places a duty of care on schools. So previously we had guidance for schools. So every school did things slightly differently, and it was just guidance, so they could pick and choose which parts that they actually implemented. Now there's a duty on care to ensure that schools make sure that children with health conditions, and not just with allergies, all health conditions, are not excluded from any part of school life. And that would include things within the curriculum and also things like school trips. It means that the school have to be much more vigilant about making sure things are safe. And it also means that schools have to produce, well, they should produce, individual care plans. Now, the individual care plan, which you've already mentioned, is put together with the parent. And quite often the parent will start the process because the child will already have one from nursery school or something similar. And the implementation of the care plan is then a duty of care on the school to ensure that that is kept and that the relevant teachers know about it. This change from guidance to the duty of care has made a big difference, because it means now that parents feel that they've got a real framework to work within, to be able to say to the schools, this is what I expect from you. So we're very pleased that this came into force, and it's made a big difference. I think on the helpline as well, you're much more able to give concrete advice to people, aren't you?
Yes, it's far more reassuring, but it does only apply to England, doesn't it? So what happens in other parts of the UK?
Yes, unfortunately it does only apply to England. Because education is devolved amongst the other countries in the UK, this only applies to England at the moment. However, we are in the process now of working with another group of health charities in Wales, and we're hopeful that we might be able to do something with the Welsh Assembly Government to get a similar setup in Wales, which means that there'll be a duty on care in schools in Wales. The Welsh Assembly Government are already very open to discussing the guidance with us, so there will definitely be a change to the guidance, and we're hoping that we might be able to get the same duty of care. Once that's finished, once we've achieved that, we'll be hoping to move on to Scotland and Northern Ireland. I think it's important to state that even without the duty of care, schools do still have a responsibility to ensure that the child is safe.
Yes.
And with the individual care plans, it is important that the parent brings in their individual care plan. And I think it's worth just pointing out, we have templates on our website, don't we, if people want to find them?
We do, absolutely, yes. There are templates that I think it sends them onto the website of the British Society for Allergy and Clinical Immunology. And they developed these care plans in conjunction with ourselves and Allergy UK. So yes, there is a link on our website, and they have one for each of the 3 injectors that are available, and also one for any future students who perhaps have allergies but haven't been prescribed adrenaline as well. Yes,
and I mean it's a great tool to have, because when you're first dealing with allergy, there's quite a lot to take on board. So the more that you can get already prepared, that's already proven to be an effective way of working is great, isn't it?
Yes.
So
I think some local authorities have their own care plans.
Oh right, okay.
But I think it's a good idea to have, obviously you will have your own for your child, and you have to work with the school to decide which one's sort of most appropriate. But it's really important that you follow the guidance that's been given for your child by their treating doctor.
Yes, I think that's really important. And when it comes to having adrenaline injectors in schools, what would you recommend is the best place for them to be stored? How would you recommend that parents address that with the school?
Yeah. I think it really depends. Obviously, in nurseries and in the first schools, these will be stored. They're usually fairly small buildings, so these will be stored in a safe place. I think it's really important to stress that wherever they're stored, they should be stored safely, but they must not be locked away.
Absolutely.
It's life-saving medication, and so wherever they are, they should not be locked away. In nurseries and in first schools, they would quite often be in a staff room, maybe in the head teacher's room, so somewhere away from the children, but not locked. As we mentioned before, I think when the children get older, possibly, it really depends. I would say that one hat doesn't fit all in these situations. There are some sort of middle schools that are quite large, and they perhaps like the older children to carry one of their injectors around with them, or at least have one in the classroom.
Yes.
And then again, the second one might be stored elsewhere.
Yeah.
And certainly by secondary school age. Some secondary school age children actually carry both of them with them in their backpack or whatever they carry around school with them. But I think it's probably more common for them to carry one themselves and then have the backup elsewhere in the school. So you would use the first one and then go and send somebody to get the backup. But of course also that the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency are soon going to be changing legislation, aren't they, to allow schools to actually carry a spare injector.
Yes.
So perhaps if you'd like to tell us a little more
Yes,
about that.
I mean this has been a campaign that the Anaphylaxis Campaign have been leading on with Allergy UK and the British Society for Allergy and Clinical Immunology, and we were very pleased to find out last month that the MHRA, who regulate medicines in this country, are now going to allow schools to hold a spare injector. The evidence for this, the reason why we put this forward as a good idea, is that we do know that there are some situations in schools where there isn't a backup injector available, and it's very important to have a second injector available in case of misfiring, misuse by the person who's giving it, or maybe it might not work quickly enough, the ambulance might not arrive quickly enough, you might need to give a second dose. But also we found within our survey that a large number of people had recorded that they were out of date when they went to be used.
Yes.
And of course, although adrenaline is a very robust medicine, you wouldn't want to use one if it was out of date, particularly if you were a teacher making that decision. So there were a number of reasons why we felt that a spare pen would be really useful in a school setting. Recently, earlier this year, last year, the MHRA agreed that salbutamol for asthma could be kept as a spare backup. So it was a follow-on from that, and we presented the evidence, and the MHRA are now going to allow schools to do that. So the way that it will work is that the school will actually be prescribed, if you like, the adrenaline injector. So the school will hold whichever brand they feel is right for the school. So if they have more of one brand than the other, they might decide to hold that brand, or they might decide to go for one of each if they've got a variety of different devices. And then what will happen is they'll keep that spare pen as a backup.
Yes. But
it won't, and I must stress this, it won't replace the child's device. So the child will still have a device prescribed to them by name, which will either be kept with the child if they're old enough, or in a central place if they're not. And then the backup will be there in case a second dose is needed.
That's a great step forward.
It is a great step forward. And I think also people often ask us, what happens if somebody isn't already prescribed and isn't actually a named person with their own device? And although this spare pen is only for children who've been prescribed, it is still useful to have a spare pen in case you need to use it in someone who's having their first reaction in school and the emergency services are telling you that it's okay to do so.
Yes, and we do get asked that question a lot by schools, saying that if we have adrenaline that belongs to other pupils, and we have a child who perhaps has their first reaction, are we able to use the adrenaline that belongs to another child? Generally speaking, we would have to say no.
Of course.
However, what we do suggest is that the school calls the emergency services and says, look, we have adrenaline here belonging to another child. We have a child that we're pretty confident is having an anaphylactic reaction. Should we use the adrenaline on this child? And leave the decision up to the emergency services.
And if the emergency services then guide the school through what to do in that type of situation, then of course then the teachers are not put in a position where they're doing the diagnosing, because of course nobody wants to be in that position. And we certainly stress that everyone requires 2 adrenaline injectors, as the MHRA have stated. So the spare pen would act as the backup second pen. But in some cases, children would still have their own 2 pens in school. So it certainly wouldn't be there at the expense of the second pen if that's what the children already prescribed. But it does help the school to have a backup. And the other thing to point out, of course, is that even if the first pen is used, even before the spare pen is even brought out, an ambulance should be called, shouldn't it, at all times?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, if you're using the adrenaline, an ambulance needs to be called, because obviously the child needs to go to hospital. They may need additional medication, and they will need to be monitored in hospital for a length of time.
Yes, the NICE guidelines state that children who've had anaphylaxis or suspected anaphylaxis, so certainly if adrenaline's been used, the child should be kept in overnight and monitored in case of a secondary reaction, known as a biphasic reaction. But also, it's very important that the school know that the first thing to do is to call an ambulance and then call the parents.
That's right.
And the parents would know that the child needs to be taken to hospital.
So you use the first pen, call for an ambulance immediately afterwards, lay the child down with feet raised. Unless they're having problems breathing, sometimes part of the reaction is that children get asthma-type symptoms, and it may be a little bit more comfortable for them to sit up. But it's important to have them down on the ground.
Yes.
And obviously, if they're feeling sick, you know, and then you lay them down with the head to one side.
Yes, yes. And it's because it's interesting, isn't it? Because adrenaline works very quickly.
It
so
does,
quite
yes.
often a child will go from being very poorly to having the injector and feeling quite well. And you
Yes.
can almost see the colour coming back to their face. But of course, it's important that you don't let the child jump up straight away, even though they might appear to feel better, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, and you're right when you say about biphasic reaction as well. So sometimes that first use of the adrenaline makes the child feel back to normal again, but it's still important to get to hospital in case they do need additional medication and that they do have a secondary reaction later on. Yes.
And just as an aside, as an adult, that you need to follow the same process. So if you give adrenaline as an adult, you still need to call an ambulance, and you'll still be taken to hospital and monitored for a period of time. So
Absolutely.
it's important to note that. So the whole going to school is quite a difficult time,
Yes,
particularly when your child is starting school for the first time. And one of the questions that we've been asked is, what happens at lunchtime? So children get their free school meals now, and they can be catered for on site. They can have a hot meal on site. But whose responsibility is it to find out if those meals are safe? Obviously, the parent needs to do some research, don't they? What would you recommend that they do?
Okay, well, it's the caterer's responsibility to provide accurate information.
Right.
And the new legislation that came into force a couple of years ago says that if somebody's buying food from a catering outlet, and that includes ordinary restaurants, snack bars, but also institutionalised catering, and that would include the likes of schools.
Yes.
So that the caterers in the school have a legal responsibility to be able to provide allergen information on the major allergens, the 14 major allergens, that are present in the food that they serve. So that responsibility is with the caterers.
Yes.
So if it's a secondary school child, for example, if they go to the canteen and they ask the staff in the canteen if their particular allergen is in any of the foods, the caterer will have a legal responsibility to be able to tell them.
Right.
So the onus on providing accurate information on the food that is served is ultimately with the caterer. However, obviously the school has a duty of care towards all of the pupils.
Yes.
So the school really should be making sure that the child is served a safe meal. So it's a joint responsibility, but the providing of accurate information is really down to the caterer. But the school should be making sure that the child is kept safe.
And this is one of the things that you would investigate in either your pre-meeting, or if the child is moving up to a new school, you would discuss that. Would you discuss that first with the head teacher or the teacher, and then ask to speak to the caterers directly?
I think that's probably a sensible approach, yes. If you speak with the staff in the school, the head teacher, and just say, would it be possible to have a word with the catering staff? Again, as we mentioned earlier, I think most schools nowadays do have pupils who have food allergies. But it is always best to make sure, and of course you may have a child who has an allergy that perhaps hasn't been present in the school before.
Yes.
And perhaps even an allergy to one of the foods that isn't on the major list of allergens. And of course the likes of kiwi is increasingly common as a food allergy. And that isn't on the list of the 14 major allergens. So it's really important to speak with the caterers. Probably in the junior schools and certainly in nurseries. It would be more up to the school to sort of make sure that the child is kept safe.
Because it's interesting, because a lot of school caterers, in fact most that we would know of, would probably not use nuts in their school meals because of the risk. However, it's not just nuts, is it? We're talking about children who are allergic to egg and dairy, and as you mentioned, kiwi, banana, various other things. There's an enormous list of things people can be allergic to.
Yes.
So if you were to find that maybe you didn't feel that your child could be safely catered for, are you allowed to send in a packed lunch for your child instead?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And sometimes I think particularly where you have children who perhaps are allergic to multiple foods, it's quite often the safer option to actually take a packed lunch in.
Yeah.
But then you have to look at what is the setup in the school, where will your child be sitting? So if the child has to sit in the canteen with perhaps the pupils that are eating hot lunches, maybe, I think it's really important to stress here that we don't want children isolated. And we do hear of the odd case where it tends to be more in the junior schools, the first schools, that children are told to sit on their own,
Yes.
and that is not acceptable at all.
One of the people that sent a question in beforehand said that her child has to sit alone,
Yes.
and it was one of the things I was going to say to you, that surely we don't recommend that.
Oh, absolutely not. No, it's absolutely crucial that the children sort of sit with peers and with friends.
Yes.
Things can be done safely.
Yes.
So if your child is bringing in a packed lunch and other children are bringing in packed lunches, if you know what they're allergic to, so perhaps arrange that they are sitting at a table with some children who aren't going to bring in the foods that are a problem for your child. Certainly in the junior schools, that there should be perhaps guidelines to say that your children should not be allowed to share foods. So they shouldn't be allowed to swap foods. Your child has a responsibility to themselves, and as they get older, they have to learn that they mustn't take food that other people have offered to them. But I think certainly when they're younger, it's a good policy within schools not to allow children generally to swap foods. Make sure that children wash their hands before and after eating, and that the tables are wiped down thoroughly. Hot soapy water has been demonstrated to be extremely effective in removing certainly peanut protein, and I'm pretty convinced that the same would apply to the other foods.
You don't need anything, any industrial wipes or anything, do you?
Hot soapy water will do the trick.
Yes.
So make sure the children are sitting down while they're eating to sort of minimise the risk of the food getting elsewhere. Make sure the children wash their hands after eating, and that surfaces are wiped down with hot soapy water. So it's all about containing the risk.
Yes.
But if your child can sit at a table with other children that aren't eating or aren't bringing in the foods that your child is allergic to, that can be really helpful.
And it's quite it's quite a sensible option in younger children, for maybe a letter to be sent to the rest of the class to say that there is a child in your class who is allergic to, particularly if the child is particularly sensitive to a certain food, or allergic to multiple foods, or in some cases allergic to food that maybe is a bit out of the ordinary, such as banana, for example, that people maybe haven't heard about. It's quite acceptable for a parent to ask the teacher to do that, isn't it?
It's absolutely fine, yes, but I think it's important to say that we don't specifically advocate a ban.
No,
exactly. Having a ban is a word that we don't like to hear, because what we like to do is have schools that are helpful to children with allergies. You can't guarantee, even if you do ask parents not to send in snacks containing your child's problem allergen, if the meals don't contain nuts or peanuts, for example. But sometimes allergens do come into schools inadvertently, with the best of intentions from other parents. They don't perhaps fully understand.
Because they're not reading labels.
Because they're not reading labels, and they don't understand, obviously, as well as a parent who's dealing with the condition themselves. So we find that even where parents have been asked not to send in particular types of snacks, they do sometimes arrive in accidentally. So I think if you're starting to say, the school is nut free, or we have a nut ban, for example, it can lull people into a false sense of security, and perhaps be even more dangerous. But certainly it's great if a letter's sent out requesting parents not to send in particular types of unsafe snacks, and if the school doesn't serve meals perhaps containing nuts and peanuts. So these are all really helpful. It's all about minimising the risk to the pupil.
Yes, and of course,
no such thing as zero risk.
There really isn't, and of course, that you can't ban dairy. In a school, and also when it comes to secondary school, it's impossible to police really what children are bringing in. So, and I think that what we're trying to say is that when children start school, it's a learning process, and by the time they finish primary schools and they move up into secondary schools, they have a much better management of their own allergies, which is what ultimately we're trying to do, isn't it?
It is, yes, and I think the responsibility is shared, certainly as the children get older. So the school has a duty of care, and they have certain responsibilities. Parents have certain responsibilities. It's important that parents make sure that the adrenaline injectors that are available in the schools are in date, and that the expiry date hasn't passed. But equally, that the children themselves have a responsibility, so that they need to be able to tell somebody if they think they're having a reaction.
Yes.
They must know not to share food. So it's a shared responsibility.
Yes, I agree. And I think that, for children who are living with food allergy, most of it is very manageable. It's something that as parents you learn about when your child is first diagnosed, and then you pass that learning on to your child. I think in some cases where children are have multiple allergies and they have coexisting conditions such as asthma and eczema, or hay fever or allergic rhinitis all year round, what some parents might think, maybe I could do with a bit of extra help, and maybe I should have one-to-one help for my child. And although that is possible, it's quite rare for allergic children, isn't it?
It is very rare to have one-to-one, yes. As you rightly said, Mandy, I think that there are some children who perhaps have multiple severe allergies, multiple food allergies. They perhaps have coexisting chronic asthma, maybe eczema, and maybe other medical conditions. Then possibly that they may have a one-to-one. But I think nowadays there are classroom assistants present in most classrooms, and I think that they are there to help children who need that little bit of extra help. So it's very rare to have one-to-one, but in some circumstances it may be necessary.
And it's worth pointing out that the extra help that the child needs when they're very young will probably not be the same help as they need as they get older. So it's worth just looking at for each year at a time, rather than having something in place that's going to follow your child around for the rest of their school life. And a lot of the things that go on in schools, such as nowadays with cooking and the making of things within the classrooms, although one-to-one help is not going to be, they're not going to get one-to-one help for everything. It is important when planning this type of thing for parents to have some type of confidence that there is an extra teaching assistant when they're very young, for example, or that when they're doing cooking in secondary school, that there is some care given to ensuring that children are safe for these types of activities.
And I think it's important that schools actually do a risk assessment.
Absolutely.
So you're right, in secondary schools, particularly perhaps where the students are doing food technology. Somebody needs to go around, somebody who's responsible for health and safety in the school, and there's got to be a staff member in each school that is responsible for health and safety.
So they have to have that.
They do have to have somebody, a designated staff member who's responsible for health and safety. So if you can find out who that is, and yes, a risk assessment should really be done to have a look at, where are the hot spots, the danger areas, in any particular day for the child.
One of the things that's becoming increasingly popular is things like cake sales, isn't it, for charity, and Christmas fairs, and also children bringing in sweets or treats on their birthdays. And of course, in a class of 30, that could be happening quite regularly. It's important to remind your allergic child, isn't it, that they mustn't take food that hasn't been checked, because that is when accidents could happen.
It is, yes, and it all goes back to this sort of not swapping foods, not sharing foods. I think quite often what happens in the junior schools, the first schools, is that ideally a letter will have been sent out if you have a child with a nut or peanut allergy, saying not to send in foods or cakes or snacks that contain nuts or peanuts. But certainly what a lot of parents do is they provide a bag of safe snacks for their child, just in case something happens that perhaps the parent isn't aware of.
That's a good idea. So the teacher would keep that in the classroom, maybe.
Yes. But sometimes I think if the parent knows in advance, then they can perhaps provide something similar to what is going to be provided for the other children, so their child doesn't feel completely different. And we do hear of some very, very willing parents who will actually make cakes for the whole class that are safe for their child. But you wouldn't expect all parents.
Or they would make a cake for a cake sale so that their child can buy it back, so that they know that it's safe. And I think nowadays, with there being so many more children with allergies, and not just with allergies, but with children with other issues with food, there is a lot more understanding about it. But it is important for parents to really stress the potential severity of their child's allergy, isn't there? That they shouldn't feel that they're being over anxious when stressing that I'm sorry, my child absolutely cannot eat that because I don't know what's in it, or I know that there is something that they can't eat.
You're absolutely right, yes, and we get a lot of parents who really feel that they get the impression when they speak to the school that they feel they're being a nuisance. Well, they're not.
No.
Your child's health is crucial.
Yes.
So it's really important that you do make sure that you're happy with the way things are organised within the school. And the school has a duty of care, and we can't stress that often enough. The school has a duty of care to make sure that your child is safe.
Yes.
So they need to be able to demonstrate to you what they are doing to make sure that your child is kept safe on a daily basis. And if there are these sort of times when perhaps there's a greater risk to your child, you know, if they're having a cake sale, or, you know, children are bringing in snacks, then the school is responsible to make sure that your child is kept safe, and to let you know what they're doing to make sure that that's happening.
And the message there is that even if you feel that you're being over anxious, or you feel maybe you're being a nuisance, then please carry on with what you're trying to do, because it is very important that your child is kept safe, but also in doing so you are actually educating the school, and most schools nowadays are dealing with children with allergies, but some of the parents whose children are now adults, young adults, they really sort of laid the way for a lot of the schools where their child was maybe the first one, sort of trailblazers maybe sort of 20 years ago, and the schools have really been able to develop and evolve as a result of that. So it's very important that we carry on telling people to sort of really push the message to keep children safe, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And one of the questions that we quite often get asked is, should we be worried about conkers in the playground?
Okay. Obviously, conkers aren't eaten, so the greatest risk to a food allergic child is actually eating the food that you're allergic to, and conkers aren't going to be eaten. Conkers are related to sweet chestnuts, and we know that very few people with a nut allergy have a problem with sweet chestnuts. Strangely, chestnuts are more commonly associated with allergy to latex.
Oh, that's interesting.
So people who have a latex allergy, apparently it's something to do with the protein structure. And the protein structure of latex is similar to the protein structure, the proteins that are present in certain foods, chestnuts being one of them. So it's more common for somebody with a latex allergy to have a problem with chestnuts. We don't hear of so many children with nut allergy that have a problem with sweet chestnuts. Although, you know, you can never say never.
Of course.
I think if you know that your child has had a problem in the past handling conkers, then obviously, you know, keep away from them.
That would probably be a localised rash on the hands.
It's more likely to be a localised rash, yes. But obviously, you know, I think if you handle something that you're allergic to, especially young children can then put their hands to their mouths, and it could potentially get a bit more severe.
Yes.
But it's unusual for children with nut allergy to have a problem with conkers, with chestnuts.
And what about if there was something like a hazel tree in the school playground? Would that cause a problem?
Well, it shouldn't do, generally speaking. You know, again, you have to look at what's happening within the school. If it's sort of in one corner of the school playground, it would only potentially be a risk when the nuts are falling from the trees.
Right.
And then possibly they'd get trampled on, and maybe that the nut would be exposed. The actual shell of the nut, it shouldn't cause a problem.
Yes.
It's the protein inside the nut itself.
Right.
So if there are trees, you know, maybe you could make sure, the school could make sure that any spillages are swept up. The child with the allergy, you know, should keep away from that part of the playground. Maybe even fenced off, perhaps. Maybe the trees could be fenced off at the time of year when the nuts are falling. It would be a very last resort. We do sometimes get parents who say, well, should the trees be chopped down? I mean, that would be a last resort. Yeah. Also, you're out in the open. So there isn't a risk of the sort of risk that you would get where nuts are perhaps in an enclosed environment. So as I say, the shells themselves shouldn't cause a problem. But it's probably wise for children with nut allergy not to be handling.
No, and it's the risk of cross contamination, isn't it? So if a non-allergic child were to pick up a nut that had been exposed, and then possibly the touch might cause a localised reaction. And I think that goes back to the idea of good hygiene within schools. And this is particularly important within nursery settings, isn't it? Where children are sharing toys in quite an intimate way and putting them in their mouths. And there could be milk residue. So it's very important to keep the toys clean in a nursery setting. And I suppose in reception class and maybe year one, there's still that sort of toy sharing that goes on.
Absolutely, and we do find, Mandy, that probably milk is a greater risk in nurseries than the likes of nuts. I think very few nurseries do have nuts, do bring nuts in. But milk is always present in nurseries. So if you have a child with a severe milk allergy, this can be a real issue. Because children, you know, that they hug each other, they kiss each other, that they have their hands everywhere, that they touch toys. So I think within a nursery setting, it's really important that the nursery staff are very, very vigilant, that they make sure that the children are sitting down when they eat, that their hands are washed, that everything, work surfaces are wiped down, that toys are washed. And if there are any spillages or anything that contains milk that's splashed around, or bits of cheese that maybe where they shouldn't be in nurseries, that they're very vigilant, and that they clean the surfaces again thoroughly with hot soapy water. But milk allergy can be a real problem in nurseries. So again, we go back to the advice that we were given right at the beginning, which is, if you're sending a child to nursery, go around and have a look at all the nurseries in your area. Get a feel for, how they deal with allergies, whether they've had children before. You can usually get a feel for whether they truly understand the issues. See if they'll be willing to do some of our online training. And we find as well, I find from having spoken to children in schools, in assembly settings, that actually children are very open to understanding about the allergies or the health conditions of their peers, and in fact very accepting of it. And I think if we can educate young children to have good hygiene, to wash hands before and after eating, and also just the message of washing hands before coming to school as well, I think could make a real difference from the start. So all of these things we work together, and we try and make the world safer, particularly within school settings. But there is a responsibility on you as parents to work with the schools. And if you've got any concerns at all, any further concerns, you can call Moira or myself. Ring us on 01252 542 029. Both of us are here until the end of today. You can ask to speak to Moira or Mandy, and we'll go through any particular issues that you might have. If you have any straightforward questions, then please feel free to email us via the website, where we'll be able to respond to you in the next few days. This is only the second webinar in our series of educational webinars, so we hope you find it useful. Any feedback would be really, really helpful. We have a very exciting series of webinars planned for next year, including guest speakers looking at adults with allergy, looking at advances in paediatric allergy. And Moira and I will be back here on the 6th of December, looking at how to stay safe over the Christmas period. So if you've got any particular questions about socialising, partying with children, partying as adults, how to deal with your extended family maybe, or any specific questions that you've had over the years on particular food issues, please feel free to email them in advance. There'll be a link coming up soon on our website for you to register for that webinar. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you found it useful. Moira, thank you for your time. Thank you, Mandy.
Moira will be going back to the helpline now, so any calls, please feel free to come back to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.